All right. Hey, everybody. My name's Jess, and I'm really excited to interview Bastiat Warren, and we've got a topic on free market environmentalism. And so, Warren, would you mind just doing a brief intro on your experience?
Sure. So my name is Warren Ray. I used to go by the moniker Bastiat online, but after some angry communists doxed me, I decided, I'll drop the pseudonym and I'll just go by Warren. So it was the reason I wanted to use the pseudonym is that by day I work as a corporate attorney in the natural gas industry. And so I work in the competitive energy supply industry, which is, it's kind of how I got interested in a lot of this free market stuff, because at first I was just thinking, why is it that there's only one provider of energy in so many places? That doesn't really make a whole lot of intrinsic sense, right off the bat. It's not the way it's always been. It's not the way it is everywhere. So why is it the case, for example, here in Florida? So that's some work that I do professionally. I spend a lot of time doing events like this talking about other issues, but it's kind of cool to be able to have everything here kind of in one neat package, being able to talk about something that I do for a living, which is free market energy and free market approaches to environmental problems. So.
I've got a few questions for Warren, and we're going to try to leave a little bit of time for some audience Q&A. So if you've got one, hold on to it. So we've got about 7+ billion people here living on the planet right now. This is all of our homes, and less than 1,000 of us have ever left Earth's atmosphere. There's this really cool overview effect. If you've heard of it before, it is when somebody leaves the atmosphere, looks down at the planet, and just has this overwhelming connection to the planet and to our home and this desire to keep it safe for future generations. And William Shatner famously left the atmosphere this summer. He just released a book a few days ago, and I've got a quick quote from him where he described what he hoped to feel in space and the crushing reality of what he actually felt. He said, "The contrast between the vicious coldness of space and the warmth of nurturing Earth filled me with overwhelming sadness. It filled me with dread. It was supposed to be a celebration. Instead, it felt like a funeral." So, Warren, when we zoom out and imagine Earth from this orbital view, the same one that William Shatner got to see, instead of a funeral, what is there to celebrate?
Well, on the one hand, I sure appreciate his point of view. I've never been to space, in full disclosure, not yet. Maybe someday, thanks to the free market of space tourism, perhaps, I don't know. But I may miss my astronaut training, I don't know, whatever. But I understand the idea that the Earth is a sort of very special oasis in the bleakness of space. After all, we arose a life form on this planet in this very unique environment. All the rest of the worlds yet discovered are all pretty barren by comparison, right? And yet, it is worth recognizing, I think, that what we have in the world today is a couple of things that are really worth drilling down on. First of all, climate change is the environmental problem, of course, the environmental concern that people all over the world are thinking about kind of more than ever. And it's really worth considering. I've never met anybody in my line of work who's actively denied climate change or who thinks this isn't real. I know that's happened in the fossil fuel industry before, but at least in the last 10 years I've been working here, everybody understands and recognizes that it's an issue. What's worth thinking about, though, is, all right, well, how do we get people to reduce their emissions, particularly in ways that allow people to still maintain a good standard of living? Because, we've got to be realists. We've got to recognize nobody is going to immiserate themselves for the sake of dealing with, dealing with problems that for them have a very diffuse feeling. Some other people, they may be very serious, but for people overall, right, the diffuse nature of something like climate change up against something like my power bill just went up by $15 this month. I mean, the average American, most surveys show, is not willing to pay too much more than that to deal with climate change, though they are willing to pay something. And what's really cool about competitive markets is they allow people different options by which they can make different, environmental choices on the individual level and eventually society-wide. So first, one thing that's really cool is there are a lot of new products that allow people to take a lot of take a lot of charge over their energy usage. Any of you guys have Nest thermostats, for example? Yeah, I mean, these are incredible in the way that they automate a lot of the way that we use energy in ways that help save us money, But in the process of saving us money, they also reduce the amount of energy that we use. They don't require us to use less energy, but they allow us to more easily use less energy if we want to. Huge problem in heating and cooling systems is that they run in times that we don't need them, for example, like maybe we're at work, for example. Well, now, through a lot of home automation products, it's a lot easier to get that same high quality of life, but use the energy that you use to get there more efficiently. So that's kind of a really cool example of the sort of technology that is allowing us to take the resources that we have now and push them further, save money in the process. Larger scale, there's a lot of great innovation with respect to energy of all sorts. Solar energy, of course, we talk about that a lot. Wind energy, in fact, at this point, some of the main problems when it comes to these new renewable sources of energy are incumbent providers who don't want any kind of competition and therefore will use land use restrictions to stop the construction. Like, I don't want to see that wind farm. I don't want to see that out in the distance. I have a right to the sunset, all that kind of stuff. I don't own this property, but I'm not going to let you build what you want to build there, the sort of NIMBY problem. But generally speaking, the technology there is better, and especially when the resources don't have to come out of China, more affordable than ever. So that's a really cool thing, I think, when we think about stuff that's good. When we think about on the meta level, one of the most promising things I've seen in my time working in this business is the decoupling of carbon emissions and economic growth. This isn't an ironclad rule, but it's come a long way, and it's something that's now been demonstrated in several countries. I first became aware of this after the fracking kind of revolution in the United States, where a lot of coal generation was gradually, because natural gas was much more plentiful and affordable, replaced with natural gas. That cut carbon emissions in this country considerably. And if you look at carbon emissions in the United States, ironically enough, this is some real shilling for my business here as a natural gas person, but the carbon emissions in the United States plateaued and then have slightly declined, more impressively than maybe any other country in the world. Now that's because of a shift from one fossil fuel to a better fossil fuel. That's not a fossil fuel with no problems, of course, but that alone has been a huge advance, and primarily, though there was some government funding and research from fracking and all of that, it's primarily a reflection of the success of private investment to make a problematic situation better. But beyond that, we've seen more generally CO2 levels have gone down in CO2 emissions have gone down in countries across Europe as well, other developed countries, and simultaneously economic growth has continued to go up. So we've seen that you don't need to, as some people once thought or feared or insisted, though energy is still used, though standards of living have generally continued to increase, we don't have the problem that we were worried about where we have to continually pollute more if we want to have a higher standard of living. That's just not the case. So there's a lot of cool technology individually, a lot of great stuff at maybe a more utility scale, and I think there are a lot of promising signs economically, I'm just looking at the data that show that, as these technologies are adopted, as people move from coal to something better, natural gas, and eventually we'll move to something better still, we see that we can have a good standard of living, which everybody insists on. I mean, nobody's going to give up the quality of their one life, I'd argue, without, ruining the planet for future generations, or indeed for the people who live here now. So I think there's a lot to be optimistic about, although I understand the sort of fear that you'd probably feel looking out into the black void of space. There's a lot to be hopeful about in terms of what we're doing down here, and it's really important to remember that economic growth, that pollution is primarily, the use of resources. I mean, in this country and in most countries, it's not just waste for waste's sake. I mean, we're doing this stuff because we want to improve our standard of living, we want to alleviate poverty, we want to live better lives. Another reason I suppose to be thankful then is to look at what's our alternative. I mean, that's something I argue about a lot, is what's our best alternative to some of these approaches. The worst environmental crimes that I am aware of all originated in the Soviet Union and to a lesser degree communist China. Whether we're talking about widespread knowledge problems like Chernobyl, for example, the worst nuclear radiation disaster on record, it gave nuclear power a terrible reputation that it really doesn't deserve. And I'm no professional nuclear shill, but most of the criticism it gets from a safety perspective is just not fair. But it rises out of a decision to build nuclear plants the way that they built them, very unsafely, because of central planning from the Soviet command economy. The worst environmental crime, by some measures, of the 20th century was the massive slaughter of whales by Soviet whaling fleets that were doing this to fulfill their 5-year plans. The Soviets controlled the economy through this series of 5-year plans. They planned everything out in advance, and it worked the trick early on in some ways when they were a very basic economy. But as they continued to develop, they didn't change anything. They continually planned everything out and required people to meet these firm targets for harvesting resources and so on and so forth. And you'd get absurdities where some years the Soviet Union would be responsible for slaughtering 75% of all the whales that were killed by human activity. They would bring these whales back to fulfill the central plan, and then most of them would rot because it turns out most people don't want to eat whale. They have other alternatives. They don't want to eat this stuff. The Japanese, do whale harvesting now and very publicly known through a lot of influence campaigns and such. And there's super low demand even for the relatively modest programs. So the Soviets were just wiping out species for nothing. This is the kind of waste and insanity you get with central planning. It doesn't even make anybody's lives better. So it's good to know, one, here we've got a lot of great incentives to help reduce it, and two, even when we have some problems, we can take some comfort knowing this is about making people's lives better, and we're trying to figure out how do we make people's lives better in a way that has less pressure on the environment. So,
let's dig into the central planning a little bit more. We probably all in this room agree that top-down solutions are not ideal and are not working. So I would like to know, what you think are some of the most obvious examples of top-down solutions as a barrier to the problem solvers being able to solve these big problems?
Yeah. I would say that some of the problems, some of the biggest problems are probably the problem of incumbent providers who protect their markets under the argument that this is what is best for the customer, right? And this happens a lot with utility companies, and I'm not trying to single out utility companies as bad. They are a fact of life, and for a variety of reasons, that's the way the energy system in the United States is set up. But it does mean that the way it's set up, a series of regulated monopolies for electricity and natural gas, not everywhere, but in most places, means that it is very difficult to make some arguments that, hey, you should stop generating with this dirty fuel. You should switch over to something cleaner. Well, if the utility company has spent a lot of money building this coal power plant, and they planned that this thing would run for 30 years, and they invested this money on the argument that, the government has said that, I'm going to be able to tax ratepayers for this plant, for 30 years. They're going to be they're not going to be cooperative with the notion that, we need to turn this off and replace it with something better because it's causing harm to the environment or causing harm to local people breathing in the air, unless, of course, they're going to be paid for that, which is reasonable in some ways, but in other ways, it also means that you sort of have, because of the monopolization, the way that government-backed monopolies work, you have the power of private avarice, which so often, as we all know, is channeled toward good ends, channeled toward very restraining ends. Fighting new entrants into the market, fighting competitive options. For example, if you wanted to buy your electricity from a supplier who generated it through cleaner means, maybe they generated from a wind farm or a solar farm instead of a coal or a natural gas plant, it makes it very difficult if your utility company has managed to convince your state legislature that no, it will be a problem for the market as a whole if you are allowed to shop for your own supply, if you're allowed to bring in electricity from a different provider over the same power lines. So I think that's a big problem. One, just a lot of incumbent providers are very invested, obviously, enough in their own self-interest, and that's not so much a problem on its own, except for the fact that their self-interest is rooted in a government-backed monopoly. So that's a huge problem. I'd say another problem is that we have a lot of regulations that make it hard for other energy sources to compete fairly, even under this kind of monopoly sort of utility framework. Nuclear power has a lot of challenges that go beyond regulation, but regulation is a huge problem for the nuclear industry, because the way regulation for nuclear power works in this country is the regulatory industry has to get, or not the regulatory industry, the regulated industry, the nuclear power industry has to get radiation emissions from power plants down to what is a standard called as low as reasonably available, low as reasonably possible. And what this means is that rather than there being a sort of objective threshold that says, all right, you want to get it down to such and such amount that's safe for human, or non-destructive for human life or whatever, they'll say, all right, if the technology allows it to be this low, that's how low you need to get it to be. And if the technology gets better and shrinks the amount even less, that's where you need to get it to be. And the reason this is a problem is it sounds good on the one hand, right? I mean, none of us wants to be irradiated, understandably enough, The problem, though, is that almost all energy sources will come with some deleterious third-party effect, whether it be the mining of the solar the ingredients that go into building a solar panel, or the much more tangible harms that come from burning a chunk of coal or burning some natural gas. You breathe in some particulate matter or something. If nuclear power is forced to compete with these, who have thresholds that they have to get down to, but eventually they can meet. If nuclear power's threshold, thanks to regulation, is as low as possible, and if you can get it lower, it needs to get there, then the end result is that it's fundamentally hobbled in its ability to compete and to build new plants. And now we've got an absurdity where, in my state, in Florida, for example, the state will subsidize nuclear power by saying, okay, we're going to build, if you even plan out a nuclear plant, we'll allow you to recover the cost of just the planning. You don't even have to guarantee that you're going to build it. We're really trying to incentivize you to do it. But it is still so uneconomical as a result of these rules that now it amounts to sort of a sweetheart deal where they'll do the planning, they won't build the plant, the taxpayer gets nothing. It was kind of a waste of money. And the whole purpose of this program, getting cleaner energy, is a failure. And sure enough, since the time we've had the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in 1975, we haven't built any new reactors in the United States until very recently at a huge expense. A couple of them went up, I think one or two went up in Georgia, plant Votal. I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but nuclear power has problems of its own. It would be hard for it to compete at baseline in some ways because it's got high startup costs, but those high startup costs are far higher than they would otherwise be if it had been, if it was on a level playing field. So that's a huge problem. And then I guess another problem I'd say is, from my own perspective as a natural gas person, I tend to think it's good to replace coal with natural gas, not just for self-interested reasons. It's good, I think, from a carbon emissions perspective. And it's harder to build pipelines than it used to be. And what that often means in practice is that people will continue using coal plants, and it will mean that people overseas, especially, who want to import more, say, American liquefied natural gas, will have to continue burning coal as well. And we are working on upping that infrastructure, particularly after the tragic events of this year. But it is a problem. It's very difficult to build new infrastructure in this country generally, even on something that we typically regard as, I'm at a libertarian convention, so this may be different, but something that is more widely regarded as a proper function of government, infrastructure. Even that has become incredibly difficult to get done in this country, and that hurts all these energy sources. I think about it from a natural gas perspective, but it's hard for people who want to do nuclear. They can't build storage facilities for waste. It's hard for people who want to do all kinds of energy. So I'd say those are the biggest problems. And they chiefly amount to just unfair restrictions that are designed or imagined to be beneficial to the public, but in practice, they really just kind of protect established interests. And I don't say establishment like sort of, I don't mean to say like the establishment. I just mean somebody who is currently benefiting from the status quo,
I've got one more question, and then let's see if anyone in the audience has some. But in 2020, I had the privilege of working on the Joe Jorgensen campaign, and so I got a chance to be with Dr. Joe on the trail. And one of the things I know is Americans are, in general, just everyone's dehydrated. And I thought, okay, let me help Dr. Joe be a candidate, take interviews in airports, and multitask like a queen. And so I would be like, all right, let me go get a couple water bottles so that way she's hydrated, doesn't have to worry about getting some water. And she said, oh, I feel so bad, or like all this trash. And creating all of this trash, getting water bottles in airports and such. And so she rubbed off on me. After the campaign, I started feeling a little guilty, found a thermos. This is actually produced by a company called Liberty water bottles, so it's fitting. But I now carry this around with me in airplanes. I don't buy water bottles very often anymore. I feel guilty when I do. So I'm really grateful that you were a good influence on me and helped me start that habit change, which I think would love for other people to start changing their habits to reduce their own consumption. But I'm curious about when we do these steps, like start doing some things to reduce our consumption, be a little more mindful. There's got to be other ways that people here in this room, listening on the stream, they might be motivated to do more than just carry a thermos, but maybe make a bigger step in their life towards environmentalism, protecting the planet. So if anybody's feeling called to that, I would like to hear from you, because you've pursued this as a career, so this is clearly a passion from you. But what are some of those steps beyond just like the small habit changes that someone may be able to take in their life?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because any of you guys use Twitter? Every so often, people will, every so often the argument will go around, how dare you ask me to stop using my plastic straw when somebody else does this, that, or the other? It's like, this is just neoliberal apologia, that kind of stuff, right? And I think it's a lot of nonsense, but there is something to it of like this feeling like, well, what can I do as an individual, right, And I think that, just thinking about it, it seems to me that some of the best stuff you can do is just decide, hey, if you're really interested in this stuff, there are a lot of interesting careers out there that you can really take part in. I know one that I know is near and dear to you. Agriculture is one that I often forget to talk about because I work in, resource extraction, as it were. But the agriculture is responsible for as much methane emission as the America's natural gas industry. It's a huge area where there's a lot of opportunity for improvement. And while some people think that the option is the way it needs to be done is it all needs to be more tightly controlled by the government. And I would argue that perhaps given the time scale that we're dealing with climate change and some of the problems, there's certainly some role for government there. But the real problem, I think, with the system is that government has turned the food production system into something that it has become incredibly efficient at generating large amounts of calories and meeting some very basic needs. Americans aren't really going to go hungry, but many people say, this is a little beyond my expertise, but make the argument that we don't go hungry, but we go malnourished because we are basically eating a lot of bad, terrible processed food. As somebody who grew up on processed food, never did me no harm. Kidding, but it is a problem. And I think it's worth recognizing that, one way to ameliorate some of these big systemic problems is to get involved in these industries, whether it be as a private, entrepreneur of some kind in the food business, or as a, dare I say it, a government employee, somebody who works in the industries that regulate these kinds of businesses. It's worth remembering, I think, there was a period in the 1990s where, at least in the energy industry, but I think more generally, where there was an attitude among government that, markets have a lot of power. Maybe we should make some room for markets. There was a big push toward competitive supply and things like energy. And a lot of times it would be wild to read some of the filings that bureaucrats would put out where they would say, look, markets can set prices because competition works, and that's about the size of it. They would flesh it out a little more than that. But, there are periods in which government is very hostile to markets, and there are periods where it is a little less so. And I think a lot of that does have to do with the people who ultimately end up working in government. So I would also say that, if you're interested in policy generally, the people who make policy oftentimes are the research staffs of the public service commissions of the states where you live. These folks often, these are issues that are very technical in nature, just by their nature, right? They're complicated stuff. Imagine, I was telling Jess yesterday, it's like you're burning rocks to make energy in a coal plant. You are splitting atoms to make energy in a nuclear power plant, and you have to make all of this stuff safe. It's wild, all the stuff that goes into it. It's very technical. And yet, a lot of it gets overlooked because either people don't want to work in government, they view it as very monolithic and destructive. Some people feel that way about energy companies. But if you have a particular point of view about the environment, it's very passionate to you, it's an issue you're very impassioned about, that seems to me to be the best way you can make an individual difference is to get involved in it. not just get involved in government as a citizen, but to work in these industries, to go to conferences where people are talking about environmental issues and have your say there. Because it is a smaller world than you would think, too, when it comes to things like, the utility industry or who regulates it. I mean, there's a lot of room for an individual to have a lot of say. And, I wouldn't say go into it, if you have no tolerance for bureaucracy and nonsense now and then. But if you do believe in the idea of government can get better, and can occasionally facilitate solutions, then working in it, I think, is the first step. So, yeah.
Let's do 2 audience questions, starting with Dr. Joe.
No, if you're only taking 2, go ahead and ask somebody else.
Do you mind? I would love to hear your question.
I just wanted to ask, being a natural gas guy, what are your thoughts about the California ban coming up on gas stoves?
Yeah.
Just background.
It's frustrating because the stoves are one of the few points that they have a point on when it comes to things like air pollution indoors, right? That is a problem when you don't ventilate. Like if you use a gas stove, right? Gas stoves are great. We have a gas stove, but we have to ventilate when we use the gas stove. And if you don't, you are burning a combustible product that does have some particulate matter in your home. And so that's a thing that, you have to use safely. And I've learned in the process of learning about this that some people use their gas stoves for the purpose of heat, which is a terribly wasteful and destructive. But this is a huge use of gas stoves. And so there is a lot of need, I think, for public education and for, more availability of, alternative resources for people who do this kind of stuff. I'm not saying that, that natural gas stoves are a problem just because people make poor decisions. I think a lot of people just don't think about this being a potential health hazard. But the reason it's also such a frustrating issue is the stoves are about, I believe, 2 to 3% of overall gas usage, and yet they are also a very tangible way that people get into using natural gas. Natural gas does have a lot of advantages for the reasons I described. It's not always the best alternative when it comes to environmental protection. It is still ultimately a fossil fuel. But when it comes to being an alternative to something like, say, a coal plant, it's really important. And, to see it kind of arbitrarily banned for reasons that are very minor, it's not great for the. It's the kind of decision that you understand in a small way, but that can have big problems too. And I ultimately don't like to restrict consumer choice when we don't have a good reason to. So.
We got a late start, so we can do a couple more questions. So I'm going to hand the mic over to Eric.
You mentioned nuclear power, and one criticism that's often heard from libertarians is that nuclear power requires some level of government subsidy, limitations on liability, and things like that. So do you think nuclear power could be competitive without government subsidy?
There may be people who disagree. I tend to think the answer is probably no, but I think it's worth thinking about with a little more nuance. Now, the issue I think you were getting at, especially with respect to liability, is while we all are increasingly aware of the fact that this is very unlikely you're going to get a nuclear meltdown, especially in a country where you've got a functional system of government instead of the Soviet Empire, nevertheless, it happens sometimes. Even Fukushima was still a big problem in the immediate area. There's still a big liability bit there, even though it was obviously nothing like Chernobyl. And of course, it is possible that we here in our hallowed country will screw up big time and we'll end up with a real disaster. It's possible, right? There's always that risk. And if the way it works now is, nuclear plants have to purchase, or plant operators rather, have to purchase some amount of insurance to cover up to a certain threshold on their own. But Congress has pledged that anything over that, they'll pick up the tab on. I don't know that there's another way you do that, really, because the threat or the risk is, while it's super low, it is theoretically massive. That if you couldn't use a major area for like 10,000 years, there aren't a lot of risks that come to that level. However, it is worth weighing up some of this use of government against some other uses of government. Is it, for example, the case that, think about what it takes to build a pipeline, not just perhaps some government funding. Maybe it doesn't require any. It might require some eminent domain. It might require relocating people off of their land. It might require a lot of uses of government that in some ways might be much more direct and tangible, and arguably harmful than, I don't say this as I'm clearly pro-pipeline, but there are uses of government that can be bad in other ways too. So I think when it comes to something like energy, which has a lot of government involved, it's worth thinking, hey, if we got to weigh up better and worse, well, maybe in this case the subsidy is better than the alternative. Maybe in this other case the alternative is better than the subsidy. I think I'd love to, I want to have more gas pipelines, of course, but I use that as an example of saying, sometimes the problem is more complex than just government is involved here. Well, what is the least bad way we can have government involved? And it seems like with nuclear power, a subsidy, not great, but perhaps better than the third-party harm of breathing in particulate matter pollution or, the taking of land for infrastructure or whatever. There's a lot of considerations. So I'd say even if it can't be competitive on its own, there are a lot of reasons that it's still worth looking at because maybe a lot of things have similar need for government to get involved,
All right, next question's right here.
Hey, so in the framework of environmental concerns, we can identify that we have main problems, main flaws of free market that can lead to externalities. So, so there are two distinct groups of guys. First, calling themselves eco-authoritarians. The second guys call themselves bright environmentalists. So. I'll start from the second guys.
Yeah.
So they say that they are technocrats, the independent ones who would be able to solve those problems using free market technological revolutions, but they should be doing policies using the civil society power. While the first guys, they are actually advocating for power of the guns to do the same. So I'm really interested how we can really solve those externalities in free market.
Yeah. I think so I guess kind of if I've tried to express anything, it is that I think energy is a little different from some industries, where I think there's got to be some role of government in a lot of it because it's just, there's so many third-party externalities. It requires the use of some scarce resources, namely land. It deals with potential problems that are of a scale that it's just difficult. Like private insurers could never theoretically cover all the risk of a nuclear plant, for example, right? They're just weird things about it that make it a little different than the manufacture of shoes or cars or whatever. But that said, I do think there is an argument among some that, look, the government needs to do all of it. And it's like, it is something that, first of all, in the United States, we've never done that. We've typically said that government should have a role in, for example, I don't know have you guys ever seen pictures of New York City from the 1880s with the just power lines and black out the sky because they had different competing sets of lines? We've typically tried to avoid duplicative, wasteful infrastructure, but have still allowed competition where that's not an issue. And I think there are some people who've said, well, climate change is such an issue that no, actually all bets are off. We need to do everything and anything right now. And I'll tell you, at least from my perspective, I think that I agree climate change is an issue, and I think government has a role to play as a result. But I am not willing to engage in authoritarian measures to alleviate that, and I don't think it's even really possible I don't think it's really possible. Like in a democratic society, for example, the point I was trying to make earlier is we're only going to pay so much more before we say, okay, I don't think so, right? But even in a non-democratic society, I mean, is an authoritarian, is Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin, for example, going to say, well, the price of energy needs to double so that we can have it much cleaner for the sake of the planet? No, right? That's not happening. So the idea that we can have authoritarianism for good, I don't think so. I think you can use some government coercion for good. But there's limits to that, and it's very particularized. And I think the alternative view is like, no, full communism now is necessary. I don't think most environmentalists actually feel that way. There are a few who do, and I think they're very wrong. So,
who wants to get the last question?
So I had a question, what you think government's role might be in terms of trying to think of how to frame this. In terms of using government resources, I guess, to green government fleets or government buildings, and what role do you think that has to play, in environmentalism, I guess, and green energy?
It's a good question because I think that's an example of something government can do that's positive. It is still an issue that taxpayers, I think, can reasonably disagree on because it does mean that the government is going to be spending more money usually in the process. Not always, depending on the situation, but typically, And at the same time, it is probably if you want to subsidize, that's, I think, one of the less offensive ways of doing it. to say, look, we have this service we need to fulfill anyway. We are willing to pay a little bit more for it to kind of, like, we at least know we're getting something for the subsidy. I've worked on projects like this in smaller towns where they, we want to build a rooftop solar on our government, on our city hall rooftop or something, right? And that's one too, where sometimes the problems we were talking about top down, the local utility would be like, no, you don't do that. You buy from us, as an example. But I think there's something to that. It's like, again, I am somebody who I consider myself liberty-minded. I don't view subsidies as an unparalleled good. I just view them as perhaps better than the alternative, right? And in that situation, that seems to me to be an example of one where, okay, we know that if we're going to subsidize, we can see clearly, okay, the money is being spent on something that, we can see is cleaner, is visible to the public. People maybe see that they can also invest in this stuff too. So, it's always got, there are always issues, but I think that's one of the better uses of it than the worse. Though there are, of course, always problems. But
I just wanted to add, part of what I think is cool about that is potentially you can sell it to conservative taxpayers who don't give a damn about climate change.
Yeah.
Because you're saving taxpayer money.
It depends on how it's done, but I think it is possible because it depends too. Like when we have low commodity prices, then it seems like it's all waste, right? But when commodity prices are high, then suddenly that renewable energy looks better, So it depends on a lot of factors. But I think you're right.
Everyone give it up for Warren Ray.
Thank you all for listening. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
It's fun to ramble on a bit.